Hello, friends. Today we're taking a look at some of the material in Romans chapter 11, verses 13 through 36. We're finishing Romans chapter 11 today. And as you know, Paul has been addressing the Jews' rejection of the gospel of Jesus primarily since the beginning of chapter 9, and how it is that their rejection of Jesus has really opened the door for the Gentiles to be saved and to accept the gospel of Jesus. Now, in chapter 11 and verse 13, Paul has a word for Gentiles and for Gentile Christians. And it's a warning, isn't it? He warns them against boasting in their newfound position in God's family, verse 18. He warns them of their need to continue to believe, or he says they too will be broken off from God's family tree, verse 20 of chapter 11. And he warns them to not think of themselves too highly or to claim to be wiser than they are in verse 25. Now we're going to find that Paul elaborates on this warning in chapter 12 and verse 3, where he warns that Christians are not to think of themselves more highly than they ought to think. The warning here is against pride and arrogance and feelings of superiority, and of course this is a warning that would apply even to us today, wouldn't it? We have been blessed beyond what we deserve, and if we're not careful, those blessings may cause us to feel prideful and arrogant and superior to others. And of course what Paul is telling us is that those blessings must not cause us to take on those feelings, to look down on others, or to cause us to feel superior to others. Oh no. Hey, all we have is by God's grace anyway. We have not merited or deserved any of the blessings or status that we now enjoy. So there's no room for boasting, only in the cross of Christ, Paul says in 1 Corinthians. Another thing that I want to talk about in this short video review and in this passage is what Paul writes about the nature of God. For example, in chapter 11 and verse 22, here's what Paul tells us about God's nature. Note then the kindness and the severity of God. Severity toward those who have fallen, but God's kindness toward you, provided you continue in his kindness, otherwise you also will be cut off. The kindness and severity of God. Paul has written about those who have been cut off because of their unbelief, as branches are cut off from an olive tree, and he's also written about those who have been saved through their faith and in essence were grafted into God's family tree, so to speak. And this verse shows, Paul writes, both the mercy and justice of God, both the goodness and severity of God. Of course, in his goodness and in his severity, God is neither mean nor tyrannical nor whimsical. No. The display of either his goodness or severity depends upon what? Depends upon a person's attitude toward him. It depends upon whether or not a person shows faith or not toward God. Still, we should know this about our God, that he is both stern and kind. That's our God. Then we have Paul's doxology, or his statement of praise. He's glorifying God at the end of this chapter, chapter 11. And this too tells us a lot about the nature of our God. Let me read verse 33 for us. Oh, the depth of the riches and wisdom and knowledge of God! How unsearchable are his judgments, and how inscrutable his ways! The depth. This points to the inexhaustibility of the following qualities: the riches of God, and the wisdom of God, and the knowledge of God. These things are inexhaustible. And when we think about that, what is Paul trying to tell us? Well, he's praising God for the fact that God is greater than human beings can fully understand. There is an unfathomability about God. It's impossible that we human beings can ever fully understand God and what he is doing. His judgments are unsearchable. His ways are past tracing out. They are past fully scrutinizing. Now, My guess is that we have all experienced the truth of verse 33 as we have tried to understand some of the verses in chapter 11. For example, what does Paul mean in chapter 11 and verses 25 and 26? Here's how those verses read. So that you may not claim to be wiser than you are, brothers and sisters, I want you to understand this mystery. A hardening has come upon part of Israel until the full number of the Gentiles has come in. And so, all Israel will be saved. What do those verses mean? They're difficult, aren't they? What does Paul mean that all Israel will be saved? Surely he's not expecting all Jews to turn from their unbelief. No, Paul is surely not saying that all the Jews would eventually turn to Jesus. My guess is that he did not mean that every person of fleshly Israel would be saved, and maybe that's the key, fleshly Israel. I'm sure he would still say that those who would be saved must demonstrate trust in Jesus and must obey the gospel. And perhaps he is referring to spiritual Israel in this passage, that all of spiritual Israel would be saved. I don't know. Granted, here's a passage that is hard to understand. And my point in bringing it up for us is that God is mysterious and that there is some mystery surrounding God. To return to verse 33, we are not privy to everything God is doing in the world or to everything God has done in the world and how he is going to accomplish his plans. All of this, we admit, we cannot fully comprehend. None of us can search out and discern the judgments of God, nor can we trace out God's ways down through the ages as he used men and nations in working out his plans and purposes. Our God and his ways are beyond our full comprehension. I think we can be glad that he has revealed as much of himself as he has. But when you think about it, do we want a God that we could fully comprehend? A God that we could fully fathom? A God that we could fully understand? Well, no. If we could fully understand God, what kind of a God would he be? He would be on our same level. And so we want a God that is not fathomable. We want a God that is not fully comprehended and fully understood. Well, that's the nature of our God. He's powerful, he's all-knowing, he's everywhere at the same time. He's also full of mystery, and there's so much about himself and his doings and his ways that he has not revealed to us. Then Paul closes out this statement of praise with verse 36, which is a good place for us to close this video. It's a great statement. It's a great ascription of praise. It's a great doxology. For from him and through him and to him are all things. To him be the glory forever. Amen. Now, if we were to tie verse 36 to verses 34 and 35, which of course we should do, what is Paul saying? Something like this. Only as God reveals himself may we know his mind. And no one has ever given anything to God so as to bring God under obligation or to put him in debt to anyone. We cannot enrich God by giving him what is already his, for from him and through him and to him are all things. But this is something we can say now with the Apostle Paul. To him be glory forever.